Hi, y'all. I'm Atticus, a bookseller at Literati bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Bethany Ball and Claire Dederer to our At Home with Literati series in support of the Pessimists. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I will be dropping the links to purchase the Pessimist from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I'll ask a selection of questions of them at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books in store or at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. And now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Bethany Ball was born in Detroit and has lived in Santa Fe, New Jersey, Miami, and Israel. She now lives in New York with her family. She is the author of What to Do About the Solomons. Claire Dederer is the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, Poser, My Life in 23 Yoga Poses, which has been translated into 12 languages and which Elizabeth Gilbert called the book we all need. A book critic, essayist, and reporter, Dederer is a longtime contributor to the New York Times and has also written for The Atlantic, Vogue, Slate, The Nation, and New York Magazine, among other publications. She lives on an island near Seattle with her family. Without much ado, I will turn it over to Bethany and Claire.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Atticus. As the moderator, I'll moderate for a moment. So we're going to do a little reading, and then I'll be asking Bethany some questions about her fantastic book. So Bethany, congratulations to you. It's so
Thank
good.
you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And I'll hand it over to you to do some.
Yes, so I'm going to read from one of the early chapters of the book first, and the book basically centers around a school called the Petra School, which is a sort of an alternative school, and so I'll start with this this section. 2 weeks after school had begun, a group of girls sat in a circle, and their parents stood in an awkward clump behind them. Behind each girl, 2 chairs were set up, and Miss Hensel stood and invited all the parents to take seats behind their children. Gunter and Rachel sat down in chairs behind Lydia. Lydia turned around and gave Gunter a hard look. She rolled her eyes and turned again to face front. She had just turned 5. Please, Rachel said to Gunter in a whisper, please don't ruin this for Lydia. She likes Soul Creatures so much. She is so happy here. Gunter rolled his eyes. What's wrong with the public schools? Gunter whispered furiously. You want to spend our retirement on this twaddle? Rachel hushed him and sighed. She had already noted Lydia's stiff shoulders. Gunter had never understood whispering. He'd never understood the need to. He never let Rachel forget that in Europe, things were different than America, that he was older and America was a terrible place to raise children. And Rachel, who hated winter as a rule, had thought, sure, if Stockholm was situated on the French Riviera, she'd move there, but it wasn't. Miss Hensel picked up a small skin drum and beat on it with a little hammer that hung from her cord. Dum, 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 dum. The girls beat the rhythm on their knees with their hands. Miss Hensel gestured to the parents with a quick jerk of her head. The parents joined in with varying degrees of participation. Rachel slapped her thighs with hearty enthusiasm and tried to catch Miss Hensel's eye. Beside her, Gunter sat up very straight and crossed his arms over his chest. The children put on their papier-mâché masks. Lydia was an owl, though it was hard to tell. And when a few days ago Rachel had asked what it was, Lydia's eyes had welled up with tears, and that next afternoon, Rachel received a note from Miss Hensel that asked her not to interfere with the creative process of the children, but rather to let the spirit within Lydia guide her. An eagle was a fine animal for Lydia, Miss Hensel had written, and it wasn't good to be too critical. Rachel felt some weird satisfaction that Miss Hensel got it wrong. It's a fucking owl, she'd written back, and then backtracked with her cursor. That was not the impression she wanted to make. Not at all. Miss Hensel came back and the children sang a song in Norwegian and then a song in ancient Greek and then another song in Basque, and they ended with a song in German. Miss Hensel beamed the whole time, and when the songs were finished, she said, "We try to bring a diversity of experience to our children." Miss Hensel asked the parents to all stand up and create an archway with their hands, and she draped a brightly colored parachute cloth over their backs and the children were led under. The parents all craned their necks to see their child pass. Miss Hensel tapped the children on each shoulder as they were now knighted in the realm of soul creatures. They took their chairs. Miss Hensel clapped her hands and the chattering quieted, and she asked that one parent please say one thing, more if they had more examples, about how soul creatures had transformed their child in the last couple of weeks. Gunther loudly exhaled, and Rachel pressed her elbow sharply into his side. She leaned over and whispered, I have no idea what to say. The parents went around and brightly described some small to large behavioral change. Rachel sat very stiff beside Gunther, and when it was his turn, he explained how he'd asked Lydia to empty the dishwasher and how she had done it very well, very carefully, and without any complaint, and that he'd been so proud of her, and that she had evidently been transformed in some small way that boded well for her future by her participation in soul creatures. Rachel relaxed. As the next parent spoke, she looked up at him and gave him a little smile, and he squeezed her hand. The children went around and presented their parents with a little burlap bag of blocks. This, Miss Hensel explained, was Freubelgaben, or Freubel gifts. From these blocks, you can build anything in the universe, she said. Friedrich Freubel was a German man who had made education his special concern. These blocks are the foundation, Miss Hensel said, the foundation of the kindergarten, and they are the foundation of your children's education. Miss Hensel then looked right at Gunther and said, Anders likes these very much in my first grade classroom. Gunther's eyes went wide. He leaned over and whispered to Rachel, well, I'm impressed. Freubel gifts. It is what architecture is based on. I played with these in my preschool back in Sweden. That night, Lydia was happy. She wore her little soul creature's crown and skipped all over the house and managed not to annoy Anders or be annoyed by him. And she did, in fact, empty the dishwasher without being told. Rachel was happy too. She could still see Gunther's face light up beside her when Miss Hensel had mentioned the blocks. And then as she climbed into bed, Gunther's face went dark. Gunther said to Rachel, did you see the dolls? No, Rachel said, what dolls? The dolls in the classroom. They had no faces. Rachel had not seen the dolls. She shook her head. Maybe the dolls are still being made. Maybe they are not finished. Gunther shuddered. It's far too creepy for me. It is the stuff of nightmares. But they must have a good reason, Rachel said. Yes, like the blocks, Gunther said, Freubelgaben. What memories I have of them. It was extraordinary to see them there. And the next section I'll read is from a chapter called The Pessimists, which is to me one of the more frightening chapters to read. But my editor loves it. And she always asks me to read it out loud. So I was really happy that Claire asked me. So in the summer, the women, this is kind of a rant, by the way. In the summer, the women jogged, hiked, bicycled, rode, and played tennis. Any time of the year, any time at all, they saw nutritionists and astrologers and therapists. They rolfed. They became yoga teachers, Zumba teachers, Pilates and spin instructors. They discreetly Botox and Juvedermed and micropeeled. They got boob jobs, tummy tucks, microdermabrasions, blood injections. They smoked joints so they could better obsessively clean cupboards and sort toys from the playrooms. They smoked joints so they could fuck their husbands without anger. They took Xanax so they could tiptoe around the yawning void. They took Ambien because it was fun, and Adderall because they had projects due at work on no sleep. All that coffee was giving them heart palpitations, and another fucking marketing presentation. And Adderall made them feel like cocaine, like the whole world was Studio 54. If Studio 54 were an accounting firm, law offices, advertising agencies, and Wall Street. They left for girls-only vacations. They lived the life. They were living their best life. They, those of them in the middle class to wealthy suburbs surrounding major cities all over America, lived in material leisure and emotional poverty. Sometimes they developed crushes on each other, on their husband's best friends. They developed crushes and love affairs on themselves, their very own selves, who they'd been mocking, deriding, and despising since puberty. Men were superfluous, dogs divine. Don't forget your Kegels. They watched everything that any of them put into their mouths. The skinny ones lived off strange rations of salmon, salad, and green juices and stopped menstruating. Heavier ones ate the same, except late at night when they ate furtive bags of chips, Entenmann's donuts, and pints of ice cream. The regular moms fed their kids cereal for breakfast and pasta with butter for lunch and dinner. The skinny mothers declared gluten and dairy poison and refused to eat it, and then fed their kids cereal for breakfast and pasta with butter for lunch and dinner. And pizza, so much pizza.
I love that. Thank you for reading from it.
Sure.
So that makes a nice segue into the opening of my book, Love and Trouble. And these books are, we were talking earlier, a little bit in conversation. So I'll just read from the first 3 pages and kind of give a sense of the shared territory, I think is the way I would describe it.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is a memoir about kind of going off the rails in midlife. I'm not quite sure how else to describe it. This first chapter is called You Now. You did everything right. You made some friends you could count on. You got a job. You found a mate, a really nice one, and you bought a house and had kids. You didn't even think about it that much. You just did it. You worked really hard all the time. You were a faithful wife, and it's okay to say it out loud, an above average mom. And you dressed cute, but not too cute. You were a little afraid. You were a lot afraid. You could feel your chaotic past behind you. You could hear the girl you were, a disastrous pirate slut of a girl, breathing down your neck. You wanted nothing to do with her. But sometimes late at night, while the babies and the husband were asleep, you drank Maker's Mark in your living room, even though you were still breastfeeding, and you listened to music alone in the dark. And that girl came closer and closer until you turned off the music and went to your marital bed and slept your dreamless, drunken sleep. You woke up and your teeth felt like nervy stubs from all the grinding. You had a headache that lived inside your teeth. You accumulated this life over a decade, maybe 2, like a midden or the nest of a bowerbird or a creepy shut-ins collection of nail clippings. Anyway, it all piled up, accreted, because that's the way you wanted it. You are the kind of person who gets what she wants. You wanted to accumulate this beautiful life, a life that, for all its beauty, ignored the person you had been. You worked your ass off getting here. You moved to the country, or that's what you called it. Just because you take a ferry boat to get there and you have farmers for neighbors, that doesn't make it the country. It's just very, very picturesque suburbs. In the fake country, there was all the nature you craved. You had woods in your new backyard and a badminton lawn and a poorly kept garden you described to yourself as romantically overgrown. Also, the schools were terrific. The house you bought was a bit bigger, so your daughter and son didn't have to share a bedroom, even though it's great for kids to share a bedroom, but maybe a little uncomfortable as they get older. You bought a nice new couch because toddlers had left the old one as stained with shit and vomit and blood as the backseat of Travis Bickle's taxi. You had orthodontia for the children who got really large, really fast in your safe, pretty house in the alleged country across the water from the city where you grew up. You mostly forgot about the girl you had been, the lost soul. She was such a clueless bitch, you didn't really want to think about her anyway. Maybe you conjured her at parties with new friends, parents from your kids' school who laughed politely at your crazy stories. You woke up embarrassed the next morning. And then one day, it's as if a switch is flipped. This day comes in April 2011, the spring you are 44 years old. You don't know it yet, but on this day, your season in hell has begun. You stumble out of bed. Your husband, a journalist, is headed somewhere far away on assignment, but before he leaves, he brings you coffee and then yells up the stairs at the children. You rise and go into the kitchen, lean dizzily against the counter, and watch them come in their multitudes. Well, there are only 2 of them, but they seem like more in the morning. Your daughter, solemn and big-eyed and possessed of a slyly wicked sense of humor, is 12, just around the age you were when you started going off the rails. Does her 12ness fill you with anxiety? If so, you're not quite admitting it to yourself. She grows more beautiful every day, even as you grow homelier, no matter how many chaturangas you perform. Your daughter appears to be coolly lit from within by some tiny inner moon. Does her comparative glowiness make you feel that your own mortality, your own youth, is drawing inexorably to a close? Again, not in any way you care to admit. Your son for now is a simpler matter. 9 years old, cherubic, and uncomplicatedly loving and gleefully loud. And here they come every morning with their crazed hair and vacant eyes. They are like sleep-hot monsters who need to have the wildness of dreaming smoothed and fed and nagged out of them. Your husband is picking up his suitcase and heading out the door, and the kids are looking for their shoes. Because from the time they're born until they're 18, there will be one constant: lost shoes. Your life is relentlessly communal. You are necessary in every conceivable way. This is how you wanted it to be. Blessedly alone at last, you sit down at your computer to work on an overdue article. Your focus is shitty. Through the open window, you hear the call of a spotted, I think you say this, towhee, which sounds exactly like the Austin Powers theme song. The spring air is the very gas of nostalgia. It reminds you of schoolrooms, of wanting to flee your desk, of the escape artist you used to be. As you sit there, you find all of a sudden you can't stop thinking about her, the girl you were. And I'll just stop there.
I love it.
Thanks. I haven't echoed that book.
Yeah.
So you were talking before we started about how there's some landscape or shared territory here. And do you want to talk about that a little bit? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think that I remember I gave your book to a friend who I would always sort of hand off my books to after I'd finished reading them. And I wasn't shocked by your book because I was just felt like that was a home for me. In that book, like there was a place for me in your book because I related to so much of it, and you were so honest in it. Like that image of the couch, with the shit and vomit on it. Just how that's the part we don't talk about, Yeah. And I gave it to her, and she really was shocked by it. I don't remember what she said. She couldn't believe, there were some things that you had admitted. I don't remember what they were, that she couldn't believe that you had said out loud, but that she related to. And I think between that and I don't know, maybe that's kind of what started this book. I feel like I felt like it was a little bit of an origin seed of me trying to go and write about and just say, you know what, fuck, excuse my language, but screw it. I'm going to write about all of it, how it feels.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that's so stunning about the book is that you are doing this work of really intimately describing the experience of a certain kind of woman at a certain age, but that's not just what the book is. The book's it's about 3 couples, and it really tells the story from multiple viewpoints. And I wanted to ask, how did you come to bringing in the male voice? And then there's some, like you read from, this kind of very opinionated yet omniscient voice, and how kind of multivalent perspective. How did you end up there?
I love books that have a lot of different perspectives, a lot of points of view. I love movies that do. I love Robert Altman, for instance. I always think that I'm writing a Robert Altman film when I write a book.
I really see that in this book.
Yeah, and my first one, The Solomons, was even more so, I think, with even more characters, and also and then Mrs. Dalloway has that same quality.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of sympathy for men, and I would hang out with a lot of guys, in high school, and they didn't shock me, I guess, was whatever they were thinking. They would be themselves around me. And so when I wrote this book, I wanted to sort of give the husband's point of view, or kind of what I imagined the husband's point of view. I mean, I only have one husband, and I don't talk to that many men. When you get married, it's harder. You don't hang out with as many men, right? Or I don't. But I could imagine, for instance, Trip looking out and saying, what this character Trip saying, well, what do women do all day long? These stay-at-home moms, being angry about it. Right or wrong, that's his perspective. So I'm always interested in both men and women's point of view.
Well, you get at that a little bit. I want to return to this issue of women and what they do all day, and the kind of way that this book looks at class and says things about money that I found much more shocking than anything about sex or drugs in the book, is the way that it kind of lays bare some truisms about upper middle class life or upper class lives and materialist realities there. But just going back to your idea that of like your sympathy for men, you have Virginia, who sometimes feels like a stand-in for the author, though I know we're not supposed to do that. That's like a really immature way to read. But she says to Richard, I feel they're talking about sex, and Richard has just confessed a proclivity of his. He's married to her friend.
Yeah.
Her husband's best friend. They're all interwoven. So
yes. Yeah.
said, I feel like most women don't want to know the truth. Like, so there's a way in which Virginia sort of is sympathetic to this character and wants to know the truth and accepts the truth.
Yeah.
That was really unexpected.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think, I do think, somebody said once that you can either, in marriage, you have to choose two ways of being. You either can be completely realistic, like both partners decide they're going to be completely realistic about what marriage is about, what the man is interested in, what the woman is also still interested in. Or you have to be completely idealistic, right. But you can't switch. You can't go between the two. You have to choose one or the other and to avoid heartbreak.
Right. That's really interesting. You have to be all in. And I can picture those marriages sort of on both ends of the barbell in my brain.
Right.
But the idealistic end, of course, you're sort of getting at in this book, I feel like, and this could be my own perspective, but that marriage and family life are rely on lies. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really hard to be completely honest in a marriage. I don't know, I can't speak for everybody, but I think in my character, if I stay with the characters, I think that they have decided, each one of them, that they have to sort of live with, untruths or look the other way. Mm-hmm. I mean, two characters get back together after a kind of a split. Mm-hmm. And, how do they do that? I mean, I don't go into it at the end of the book, but, how do they live with that? I don't know.
Yeah, I want to go back to this idea of untruth in a second, but first I just want to know a little bit more about, like, this is such a specific milieu, and it's a milieu that has, it's the way that the way that you've written it, so up to the minute, is your own thing, but it has a very hallowed literary tradition. And I wanted to know if you felt, writing about Connecticut, about these kinds of people and, these commuters, this Cheever country.
Yeah.
I wondered how much that loomed over you as you wrote.
I try not to pay much attention to books that will be similar. Mm-hmm. So I was not obsessively reading Cheever or Richard Yates
right.
Or while I was writing this book, because I think that it was just, hold on, my dog is wanting to go out. 1 second.
No problem. I feel like I should cuddle or something.
I try to stay away from that, but I think that I'm in that world, in a way, not that this is my community, because it's really not. I really felt like I was writing apart from my community, but I play tennis. Mm-hmm. And so even though our club is sort of this like very chill, it's called a field club. And, we would go to these places in Connecticut, in Greenwich, and places that cost, $100,000 initiation fees. And I would hear conversations around me. And that was kind of the impulse to have this very waspy, world. This kind of like, the German wooden toys and the progressive ideas, they all seem very sort of waspy to me.
Yeah.
Specifically,
often not written about. I think that, especially in the first passage you read, I mean, the second passage is more a highly quotable onslaught of rage. But I loved, but the first passage really gets at the I'm not a person who's very up on the difference between satire and parody. So forgive me if I get the terms. I mean, but the satirical nature of the prose, it's really comic, and there's moments that I was laughing out loud when you're reading, just because the affect is so flat at certain moments, and your affect as a writer that's flat is letting us know, is giving us a little bit of an into your perspective on these characters in a way that's simultaneously empathetic, but also like, a little bit like dissecting or looking through the magnifying glass that comes out satirical. And I guess one thing was because, these are, how do you walk that line in building characters like this between caricature and characterization?
I think that when I look at the three women, for instance, I think that they have a lot of my characteristics, I'm always mining myself for thoughts and feelings, and even really unflattering ones that can be really useful for fiction, for characters. And so part of me doesn't feel too bad about making fun of these characters, because in a way it's like a self-parody, even if they have different names. So I do obsessively clean my house, like Margot, and like Virginia, I can also be really like, just, kids, please eat a peanut butter sandwich and leave me alone, So I feel like I'm, and of course I see in the wider, in my friends or the people around me, I see things too. But if I'm really going to zero in on something that's unkind, I feel like it has to kind of come from me. I don't know.
Yeah, I felt like that moment, there's so many nice moments in that section that you read. But I especially noticed the part where Rachel's, I don't know, remember how she's sort of adjusting herself somehow, because she says that's not the impression she wanted to make at the school.
Yes. Yeah.
And that really struck home with me. And it also kind of came back to, these characters are performing for each other, which is really interesting. Like there's a sense of being watched all the time.
Yes.
And a right way to be.
But that's what motherhood felt like to me. And maybe just I was a paranoid new mother, but it felt like that to me. It felt like, if my kid was acting nutty, there was always somebody to come along and say, oh, your kid is so something, just in a way to just let me know that it wasn't a good thing, what was going on. And, there was, of course, there's lots of beautiful moments of kindness. And sometimes I wish I had put more of that in the book, honestly. I'm watching Succession. I'm obsessed with Succession. And, you never see the characters being nice to their children or really to anybody. But in a way, that's what makes it fun, because you don't care about them that much, because they're so unlikable that you can enjoy their sort of downfalls in a way. And they're so rich,
Yeah.
But so in my book, sometimes I wish that I had been like, I had gotten more of those moments of kindness between people. I tried, but it's more fun, to write this kind of satire of these people. And I think it's true too.
Right. And one of my questions was, I was thinking about, you're talking about this unflattering, it's almost like this inside out unflattering self-portrait, right? It's these unworthy thoughts these people are having. And when we first met, we were at a weekend for mutual friends of the great writer, Kim Brooks, who I think is here. And she gathered some of us together to have this weekend. And it was a really interesting group of people. And what emerged over the weekend as the sort of ongoing topic was the problem of the unlikable female character.
Yeah.
And this sort of idea that there isn't a character that's like a kind of big swinging dick or charismatic megafauna, yet unlikable, sort of Don Draper kind of character. What you get is a lot of, like in memoir, you get self-deprecation.
Right.
And in fiction, you tend to get sort of hapless, daffy women who are sort of, but you don't get sort of assholes. And one of my questions was, did you have a temptation to make your characters more lovable? Which I feel like you just addressed a little.
Yeah, I mean, only in retrospect. Yeah,
I was glad I felt like you picked up the gauntlet and went for it. And I was
I just went for it. It was dark.
Yeah.
Some of it was dark, but Agnes is kind of in a way, she's sort of a little bit of a big swinging dick asshole character.
Fair. Yes. Yeah.
She doesn't, I mean, and I think that Agneses exist. So
yeah. And how did she come to you? Like, was the school a vehicle to bring us Agnes, or was it just very clear, like any town like this is going, that's an elite, is going to have an elite school that becomes the nexus for a certain kind of parent?
Yeah, I think I went to a progressive school, but it was in a city school to desegregate a school, actually. So I was familiar with the sort of progressive school thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a few of them around me. When I sent the book out to people to have it blurbed, they sent me back, oh, this reminds me of my kid's Montessori school. This reminds me of the Waldorf school. This reminds me of the, of course it's none of those schools, but I did take from message boards of kids who had gone to Waldorf schools or other progressive schools. I'm sure Waldorf schools are great. I do not want to but yeah, I like the idea of this charismatic cult. It's kind of a cult.
Yeah.
This particular school. And I really enjoyed, there was a book I read by her name, Francine Prose, where she writes about a cult.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to go there too, and I think that parents are so vulnerable that they're like a great mark for somebody who's going to say, hey, I'm going to give you what your kids need, because nobody really knows what their kids need. That's the problem with parenting in America.
Well, was that part of bringing in Gunter, was to create this contrast to American parenting? Yeah,
because I live in a pretty diverse community, and everybody has a lot of different opinions about parenting. I have a friend who was a teacher who is from Finland. So she has a lot, Finland is supposed to have the best schools in the world. So I've heard a lot about schools in Finland. And so and because I live in this area where people send their kids to my kids go to the public school, but kids are going to really fancy schools in Westchester. And I mean, there's any school you can imagine is kind of around here. I live right outside New York City. Right. So there was a lot of material in the air.
So, one of the things I really admire about this book, and I've been thinking about a lot, is it's domestic, in terms of a lot of its concerns, and then there's the school piece, but it's also about the end of the world.
Right.
And there's this way right now in which I think there was just a literary kerfuffle about a certain novelist saying that every book must now wrestle with climate change. But there's something, to me, there's a magic trick or something to this book where you have written a small scale human-sized novel that wrestles with the idea of the apocalypse. And was that all? And I feel like that is not only thematically fascinating, but it really informs the tone of the book and the quality of menace. And was that always part of the idea, or was that something that kind of rose as that culturally became more resonant?
Yeah, no, I started writing back in 2011, I was writing short stories about a guy who believed the end of the world was going to happen. I knew a guy who was going and prepping for the end of the world. Yeah. And so I kept writing these sort of like trying to be funny pieces about, or short stories about a guy who thinks the end of the world is going to happen. But he's kind of like the last person who would, find themselves in a survivalist place, kind of thing. And at the same time, I was writing a book about a school. I had a novella, which is what this book was wrapped around.
Mhm.
And so I married the two of them together. I thought that they would work well together.
Yeah, they really do, I think. I guess I've been thinking about this quote I heard, that somebody was talking about the idea that one of the reasons college admissions have become even more intense is because everybody's trying to secure a place in the lifeboat for their child.
Yeah.
And do you feel like that is part of what's animating these people, or?
Yeah, that was what you said is kind of exactly what I was thinking about the whole time I was writing this book, which is that this kind of white middle class, upper middle class is so focused on their own offspring, even if they're liberal or progressive, that, I mean, at least up until Trump, right? Or right around Trump, that that was the only thing that seemed to concern everyone around me. You know, Obama was president, so we were pretty, like, we felt pretty good,
Right.
And a little sleepy, and not really seeing sort of the stuff that was on the horizon, which was Trump, which was, just everybody, not just people securing their place in the lifeboat, but like literally securing their bunker in Las Vegas,
Right. Yeah.
So on the other side of the political spectrum. So it was like, I was kind of angry and mostly at myself, really, for my own passivity. Like Guantanamo is something that just enraged me, that we were just going to let people just rot. I just couldn't believe that this is America. And of course, we have to be so focused on our children, because we have no safety nets. Many of us have no extended family. There's no one to help us. It's just us.
Right. And that's by design. I mean, we've all been atomized.
And I think that is by design. Yeah, that's exactly right. So.
Yeah, I tried to write about this in my first book, which was largely about parenting, and came out in 2010, I think. And this idea that I think once I really opened my eyes, I was just shocked by the level of just attention to detail people were pouring into their parenting. And it was like everything that had looked outward and political turned back inward into the house.
Yes.
And the degree of fine tuning of every last little thing.
Well, and I think, and the other thing about this novel that sort of, I mean, I think novels sort of, for me, come out of rage in a way. Mm-hmm. And just the idea that mothers were expected to now be home, right? If you were a progressive mom, you were expected to sleep with your children, extended breastfeeding. And I mean, that's just such a throwback, to like cavemen. Right. I mean, and it's totally fine if that's what you want to do. But I felt a ton of pressure around me, and it felt sort of anti-feminist, honestly.
Well, it's really interesting to think about that kind of socially coercive attachment parenting, and how it relates to a theme in your book about the men wondering what the hell the women do all day, or the women who have jobs. They're like, well, we all know those jobs don't really count, that the men are the real earners.
Right.
And there's this sort of, it's the system that feeds itself, because you have to sort of perform all of these really excessive forms of motherhood, and then you can't make money, and then you're told your money doesn't matter, so you shouldn't work anyway. And it's just this like kind of, you really laid that bare in a way that was kind of heartbreaking, actually. And for me, rereading that was some of the most painful stuff in the book, was the men's, and the women's perception of female labor, which was devalued on every front, whether it's in the market or in the home. The women's labor had no way to be valuable. And I think that capturing that catch-22 was really powerfully rage-inducing.
Yeah, it came from rage.
So good job. I was thinking,
like an exorcism.
Yeah. And I guess going back to this idea of the end of the world, I was thinking about what you were saying earlier about untruths, and thinking about like this good liberal household that is supposedly doing everything they can is like operating within this system of untruths that have to do with not acknowledging, other people's pain, or the fact
Yeah.
that the world is dying, we're
Yeah.
becoming extinct. So
Yeah.
there's this thematic untruth, because the way you evoke the apocalypse in this is really powerful, and yet nothing ever sort of happens around it.
Right.
Like, how did you navigate that?
It's funny because when I first started writing, when I was writing the book, I think it was it was after Trump was elected. But it was like the idea of the apocalypse was kind of, the 2012, the end of the world, the Mayan prophecy of the end of the world. And I wrote an essay about it, and I'm a little bit superstitious. So there was something in me that was like, well, maybe the world really is going to end, and
Yeah.
when maybe that's really what happens, and Harold Camping was on, he was saying the world is going to end on this day.
Mm-hmm.
And it really got under my skin. And then I just got over it. And I was like, this is ridiculous, Bethany, pull yourself together. But it was kind of what fed the novel. And then Trump was elected. And then it felt like, oh, the world is ending. I mean, the world as we know it is ending. And COVID, all of that was, everything that I was doing was before that, all the writing. So I was kind of laughing at the idea of people believing the world was going to end, laughing at myself believing that the world was going to end. And then the book comes out and it feels like the world has ended. So
yeah, it's really felt the moment it landed, it was a really perfect moment to land. And it made me think a lot about, and I don't, necessarily adhere to a generational model, but it did make me think about, I'm a little older than you, but we're both basically Gen X.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how sort of the book made me think about how ill-prepared these people are for the end of the world, and sort of as if our people our age are sort of ill-favored in terms of engagement with the apocalypse, because I feel like my kids who are 20-ish are very comfortable with the idea that the world's ending. They're enraged and they're like in the streets but they've accepted that, and they've accepted living with the rage and the despair as part of their life. And I think it's like, well, we can either despair or we can party. Right.
Yeah.
And I think people who are my parents' age are like, oh, it'll be fine.
Right.
And we're in the middle, sort of like, oh, this is much worse than I thought. But we're not sort of
we were sort of promised that our, everything would get better. We would do better than our parents did.
Right.
That's what we were promised, because, our parents had come up, my parents were born right before World War II, but there was so much prosperity, and we were promised that. And we kind of knew it wasn't totally true, I think. And we didn't really want to do what our parents had done anyway. We didn't really want to do 30 years in a company and get our gold watch.
Yeah.
But then we realized that's kind of what you're supposed to do. And the millennials, I think they got none of it,
Well, structurally, the nature of labor changed, because now, this massive percentage of gig economy workers.
No pensions. Yeah.
You're sort of piling up questions, but I wanted to ask one more thing about, I think we should, Atticus can jump in and say if he thinks we should move on. I want to make sure we have more questions. I wanted to ask about, I had started thinking about the concept of being okay as I was rereading the book, which is interesting because that's what you end the book on, is a note about how someone's going to be okay. And I guess this is sort of a cheesy book club question, but I really wonder, do you think things are going to turn out okay for these people? And what would okay look like?
Oh, that's a good question. In my first book, I ended on this Arabic phrase, which is one day onions, one day honey. I can't remember how to say it. It's like Yom Basel, Yom Azel, something like that. And so I always feel like I want to end on honey, because because it could go either way, right? It's either the next day is going to be great or it's going to be terrible. So that's kind of what I think, that they'll just continue on in the roller coaster of one day great, one day terrible. Bad things are going to come at them.
Yeah.
But they're going to have great days too, I guess.
Well, that's more optimistic than I expected from you.
I know. If I didn't have kids, I probably I wouldn't be optimistic at all. But I feel like contractually, I'm forced to be optimistic for them.
That's how I felt until my kids became such intense pessimists.
Yeah.
Last few
Well,
weeks.
I have an 18-year-old and a 13-year-old, so we're still trying
Good.
to keep it. Yeah.
That's good. Should we open up to questions or
Yeah. Atticus?
more minutes?
Yeah, thank you guys so much for this conversation. Two of the questions that stood out in relation to some of the last couple of conversation points. The first one from Leslie M.W., who commented on the quote survivalist stuff as fascinating them, and felt so realistic. And was that a lot of research? And then the second question from PLF. Would you write parenting any different in the current political landscape than in the former? Are parents any more politically aware or involved? And does this create less attachment with the children's own day-to-day energy, school politics?
Oh,
those are the
interesting.
two that kind of relate to the last two.
Right. So the first question, survivalist. Yeah, I did do a lot of research. I read like Tom Brown, who is a survivalist guy in New Jersey, and I watched videos about survivalists. I went on some message boards between survivalists. I mean, I think it's like so. I was fortunate that I chose that topic because it was so in the air. It was like you didn't have to do much to research that topic. I think you just had to be a little bit curious about it. And then the second question, what was the second question? Oh, parenting. Yeah, I do. I definitely think that people are much more politically aware. And then I hope, my friend Kim Brooks, who I think is here, wrote a book about parenting in the age of fear, and the idea that maybe it would be beneficial to all if we let kids sort of, roam more freely in the neighborhood and weren't micromanaging their lives. And maybe that would free us up to be more politically aware parents, which I think is a good thing, rather than so micromanaging and spending every second trying to create the perfect child to get their place in the boat. We should, we should look around us and get everybody in the boat, and I think one way to do that would be that maybe real estate shouldn't decide how good our schools are. That would be a good start, which is something I wish more people would talk about. Yeah. So
something that spurs in me is that I'm 22. So when you're saying, have young kiddos, youngish kiddos who are kind of pessimistic and in this funky, weird space of knowing that the world is ending. Curious what you think for your kids this world of potential parenting is. And I know from a lot of my friends, people don't want to have kids.
Well, I don't blame you.
What do you say to those people?
I do say that I don't blame you, because it's a pretty tough world to have children in. I mean, in so many ways, financially, and that there's no safety nets, and the health insurance is terrible, and the schools depend on where you live. If you have a good school, you have to have a good, nice house. Even if you want to live in a little shack and you don't care about materialism, your kid could go to a school that's really substandard. That's unfair. That's inherently unfair and un-American. And so I hope that that you guys will go and change the world, and we'll be right behind you.
Yeah, that's definitely my kids' perspective at 20 and 23 is like probably a pass, but we're sort of stepping into the rubber meeting the road, because like my 23-year-old is sort of starting to have those feelings of like cluckiness and like, oh, babies are really cute. And, you know, I don't necessarily want a partner, but do I want to, you know, go down this road? And so it's like, that is really powerful too, the biological human.
There is a biological, man. It's something just came over me, and I had 2 kids. I mean, I never even knew I wanted children, but something just happened to me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a reason why the species keeps going on, even when, you know, things kind of suck. So,
but I think
that's
it's
part of it.
interesting that, you know, there is also this, I think from my kids, there's also a perception that care doesn't, they have a much stronger sense that care doesn't just travel within a family, that our responsibility to care, as you were saying earlier, goes outward or goes in different directions, or we hold other people, even people we don't know, in our minds. And they're much, and the kids I know who are their age are much more reflexive about doing that in a way where I sort of have to, as a mom, kind of like, okay, right, other people, you know, sort of after being inculcated in this culture of motherhood that's so concerned with my nuclear family for so long, that's not as automatic for me. But for my kids, that idea of care, it does seem, I mean, not like they're so great, whatever, they're fine, but it is a more expansive idea among them. And
because the nuclear family is like, feels like death, I think, to a lot of people. It's actually, it's pretty lonely and tough. You know, Kim, our mutual friend, and I were talking about that maybe people get divorced in part so that they can have more community, you know, because you're divorced, your husband goes and has a girlfriend, and now that's a more of a extended world that your children can inhabit and have support in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it does create this sort of, yeah, these threads that are connected.
This communal parenting, yeah, which is so important. I mean, I was shocked at how lonely it felt when I had my son. It was very lonely.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it is really, that's a really interesting way to think about the experience of kids growing up, you know, with all that attention. Maybe all that attention is kind of lonely too. Like, you know, it seems like it wouldn't be lonely, but maybe there's like a isolation to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what do you think the antidote to the loneliness is?
Oh God, that is such a good question. You know, you think about things like communes, which I've thought a lot about. I wrote my first book about a kibbutz, and in some ways that was heaven. I mean, that for children, that was just ideal. The kids would go to a dining room, and all the families would all eat together. But you know, it's a big group of people, like 1,000 people. But there were some real problems with that too, serious issues. And so I just don't know I think definitely we need some social safety nets. That would be super helpful. You know, like in Denmark, I have friends in Denmark, and their kids go to like an after school place. All the children go there after school. They just immediately walk over to this after school facility. And, you know, we don't have anything like that. I mean, that sounds like fun to me. I think my kids would have loved that.
Yeah.
But we never had anything like that yeah.
Yeah, there's like a sterility to the setup that somehow, how do you push that? How do you get rid of that? You invite more people in, I think.
Yeah.
You just you do it yourself. You have to make those connections in that community.
I mean, I have to say, if there's anyone from my community here tonight, that I have a fabulous community. I have found a really, really wonderful place to raise my kids. And it does feel like that, kind of almost a kibbutz, but we all have it. But it took me a long, long time to find this place. And like you read my bio, I really bounced around. All those places I lived in were after I had my son. I was searching for a community. Everybody said Bethany will never be happy. She's just going to like wander the earth looking for the place. And I found this wonderful place outside of New York City that is it's just a great home. So it's out there, you know,
it'll be okay.
Yeah. So maybe, yeah, we'll be okay.
Yeah. Well, I guess, I mean, before we go, because we just have a couple more minutes, but I wanted to ask you one more question to end on in a selfish way. So I'm just finished writing this new book about bad people who make great art. And it also deals with how we, as writers or artists, how we sort of deal with the selfishness required to do our work.
Yeah.
Right. And like, is that monstrous to do our work, to shut the door on the child? And I just was curious, given this book where there's this like very high premium placed on maternal availability,
Yeah.
like how does that play out for you as an artist? That tension between creating that experience with your children and then shutting the door and doing what you've done here, which is create a beautiful work of art.
Yeah, every time I had guilt about that, I would say to myself, well, I'm teaching my daughter to do the same, and I'm teaching my son to facilitate that in his, if he has, if there's a mother to his children.
Right.
Because my husband was super supportive of any artistic thing I did, and I just think that was a good model for them. And yeah, sometimes they say to me, you're always writing. I always have my laptop open. I'm always trying to work on a book. But of course I try to be a good mom too. But I do tell myself that, I want them to do the same. And I hope that I'll be around to help, as a grandmother.
Right.
But so I just worked really hard not to feel too guilty about it. If kids watch TV, that's okay. I want to write,
Yeah.
I mean, I just felt like it was important for them to see me go after something that I wanted so much, which was to publish a book. I thought that was a good role model for them. And I thought that was as important as having me ever present, which of course I am ever present because I'm at home writing
You're always
books.
there. Yeah.
Right. So,
well, I mean, it is interesting. Like this whole, I've been thinking a lot about the difficulty of being a working parent because of what's been going on with the Supreme Court this week. And this like new argument that it's easy to be a working mom, so we don't need abortions.
Oh my God.
And just reflecting on the labor of being a mother and how structurally unsupported that is. And, good for you, because it's like, I think a lot of what I've experienced as a mother is sort of not having that structural support and then having the guilt. And I think like, I'd have one or the other, just like, don't sort of do your best and like, try not to have the guilt. I think that's,
I mean, my mother worked when I was growing up. So she was a role model, I think, in that way. And she needed time for herself. I mean, I had I think my mother paid $30 a week for childcare for me. And that included like breakfast and after school care from a woman. And it wasn't amazing.
It wasn't a faceless doll experience or whatever.
Yeah. But she kind of ingrained in me to work that, for her own. I mean, I think that my father did this thing where he went out. She was miserable being a stay-at-home mother. She was absolutely so unhappy that my father went out and got credit cards for her and said something like, go buy clothing so that you'll go back to work. She was a teacher.
Huh.
So that you can afford, like some incentive to say, listen, just please go back to work. Just, I beg of you, please go and start working. And she was one of the only mothers in my neighborhood who worked.
Well, it's so interesting because labor is so much, how labor is valued is so important in this book, right? Yeah. And she really, that was a big part of her own value, her own self-worth, was that she worked and she made good money. She worked in Detroit as a public school teacher and she made really good money and she had a fabulous pension. So, she was really proud of that. And I was proud of her too. Well, I'm glad to hear it. My mom didn't work and I have a lot of guilt. So I don't know if those two things are related, but maybe they are. Atticus, do we have time for a couple more questions or should we?
I think that's all we got, just so we can kind of keep it around the hour mark for the YouTube.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, but I've got a little kind of thing here at the end. So thank you to everybody who's come. It's been an honor, Bethany and Claire. Thank you for this conversation, and thank you to everyone else who's joined us to our At Home with Literati series. I can say it. And be sure to buy The Pessimist. The link is in the chat. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Atticus.
Congratulations,
Thank you, everyone.
Bethany.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a good night.